Welcome to Too Complicated for History. My name is Isaac Loftus, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey
And
there.
twice a month, we bring you the history that fell through the cracks of your curriculum through interviews with historians about their work and research. Longtime listeners of this show have known that we've covered Native history on several occasions, from the deerskin trade in the southeastern United States to the history of the Osage Nation. However, today we're covering a similar topic, but one in a way that's far more epic and broad in scope. Lynn, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, I'm very excited today to have Dr. Kathleen DuVal, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also the author of the new book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Lynn and Isaac, for having me here. I'm really excited to join you.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to talk about the book. As a historian, when I saw A Millennium, my heart kind of skipped a beat. Like, that's a long time. That's a lot to cover. So, I'm interested how you kind of came to this topic and decided you were going to tackle such a large timeline.
Yeah, well, as a historian too, right, I started on smaller topics, shorter time period. So I began my career as a historian of really the colonial period, which is already, it's not a short period, but, as I saw it at the beginning of my career, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, basically, only three centuries. And particularly came to focus on interactions among various Native groups and various European groups in that time period. And so in this book, I wanted to tackle a millennium. I wanted to scope out from that. There's been just really a generation of two of really great scholarship, some of which you've had on your show, of that period, of the period of early America, and really showing the continuing power of Native Americans long after Europeans first arrived here. And in this book, I wanted to go earlier and go later. I wanted to go back to the 1400s, 1300s, 1200s, centuries when Europeans weren't here yet, and really talk about not only what Native Americans were doing then, but historical change in those centuries. And then on the other end, take it to today and talk about the continuing presence and sort of active sort of historical movement of Native nations and Native Americans today, and really connect for readers that long history.
I mean, we love that on our show because it's always about why is history so important? And you've kind of just answered that question yourself by saying, look, I'm going all the way up to today. And that's why, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it was so important because it's impacted and it's tied into today.
That's right. Exactly. And I think there are lots of Americans today who see Native Americans here with a really active presence on TV, in the movies, in front of the Supreme Court, and maybe are interested in what happened in this 1,000 years before that and how we got to where we are today. Why there are still so many hundreds and hundreds of Native nations around today.
Right.
Yeah, it's some of the most exciting scholarship that we've interacted with, where it's like it has always been there, but it's sort of the reintegration of that story into the American story that is fascinating, and much more impactful than the impression that I got coming through a typical American curriculum.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, out of curiosity, where do you start? Like, what? Because this is such a, both. I guess I mean that both on like a meta level. Like, where do you start the work and sort of like you're thinking about the work, but also, what is the starting point that you chose to decide? Is it a strict 1,000 years or?
It's pretty close to that. So my answers to those two different questions are different. Like I started in that middle period because that's what I knew best, and only sort of gradually convinced myself that I could talk about things long before that and today, because as a historian, that's an even, harder thing to convince oneself of, that you can talk about the present. That's we try usually shy away from that. The book begins. The introduction begins with with the 21st century, but then when it moves back in time, it's pretty close to 1,000 years ago. I start in the year 1006 with what we would call today a supernova. People didn't call it that at the time, but it's basically a giant star in the sky. And I start with it because it's something we know people all around the world saw and talked about, and in places where there was writing, wrote about and left us things to read about it. So one of the problems with writing about North America 1,000 years ago is, at least in this part of North America, the part that's now the United States, there weren't systems of writing in the way that we have later. And so people didn't leave written documents for that time period. And so by starting with this star, this extremely bright star, I can see how people wrote about it in other places and infer that those are the kinds of discussions that people might have been having in North America at the same time, to sort of set the stage of this is North America is not an isolated place, a place that has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It actually is a vibrant place, and a place that's involved in history. And in fact, when North Americans looked up and saw this star that you could see during the day, people said it was as bright as the moon at night.
Wow.
Like people in many other parts of the world, I think there were people in North America who thought it's time to make a change. And then we see the evidence in the archaeological record and in oral history of that period as being a time of great change in North America. So it sort of gets us off and running in two different ways that I want the book to do. One is to really look at this place, this part of North America on its own, and understand how different it was in some ways from other places, but also to see it as part of the trends of the world, and not as some primitive sort of place.
Yeah, I feel like in school we kind of learned. Well, they always start with the Pilgrims, but it's Jamestown. So let's say as a Virginian, Jamestown.
Right.
They show up and there's just, this some primitive people, and they're like, we'll fix you. And then they eat a lot and make Thanksgiving. And then, we go on from there. So it's sort of very different than what your story is telling, which is really nice, actually.
Yeah. It's so odd to start that way because, for one thing, that Puritans get to New England, what they call New England, and there's somebody there who speaks Spanish already. There's somebody there who speaks English already. Like Native Americans are already part of the Atlantic world, long before the English get in on things in the early 1600s. So yeah, there's a long history that has to be sort of chopped off if you want the Pilgrims to begin everything.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. That's patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show. It's very Anglo-centric.
Yes.
Exactly.
So before we get too far, I did want to talk about language, because I know we always try to be careful about how we refer. We say Indian seems so awkward because it's based on a mistake. And then, okay, what about native nations? That seems respectful. But then you point out that the term nation is a European term. And so we're still putting, sort of European view on them. So how did you deal with that? And, even today, how do we deal with, being respectful and using correct terminology?
Right. So one of the most important things is to recognize exactly what you just said, that every overarching term for Native Americans is imposed from the outside. And some of them have definitely been taken on by Native people themselves, but it all comes in 1492 or later. There's no word that means all the native peoples of the Americas before that, because they don't need a word like that. They would just be humanity, right?
Right.
And so it's kind of what I say in the book and try to do in the book is every time I can refer to a specific native nation specifically, the Chickasaws or the Navajos, or even smaller than that, a family or a clan or a town. I try to do that and avoid those big terms when I can. But of course, as you notice, even the title of the book is one of
Right.
those big terms. So just in using nations, nation is a theme I take through the whole book, and its purpose is to show 1,000 years ago Native Americans were in polities, right? They weren't just running around hunting and unorganized, right? They lived in societies with governments, and in some ways similar to the ways other early modern people lived around the world. And they still do today. That to be Native American today means not only to be a descendant of Native peoples, but also to be a citizen of generally a federally recognized or state recognized tribe within the United States or another country of the Americas. And so I think nations, for me, it provides that continuity of helping us think about Native American as a political category, and only sort of in more recent times as a race, sort of the way we've defined races.
Right.
But at the same time, yes, it's a word that comes in from the outside. I sort of justify it because it's when the Spanish and the French and the English first came here, that was the kind of word they immediately went to describe Native peoples, not as sort of disorganized or nomadic, but as
Right.
actually living in nations. Whether and the appropriate word in each of the languages of those Europeans is what comes up very quickly, and it is the way often that Native peoples defined themselves when they were talking to outsiders. Now, on a daily basis, they might have thought of themselves more a part of their family or their town, but in sort of high politics and war and diplomacy, they were in things that they described with their own words, but as polities like nations.
So can you, starting in 1006 with the supernova, is there can you paint a picture for what North America was like? Because I think it's hard for us to imagine, actually.
Yeah. So it's in around then what is happening in North America is what is happening also in Western Europe, and parts of North Africa. It is the medieval warm period. So it's a time when the climate was relatively warmer to periods before, and spoiler a little bit, after. It's a time when, and also climate conditions like rain and temperature were a little more predictable than they would be in the period after and had been in the period before. So why that's important is agriculture spreads in that period. So agriculture starts in different parts of the world. It starts in Mesopotamia. It starts in central Mexico, two of the places where agriculture starts. And some of the ways of growing things that we think of as agriculture had already spread to places like North America and Western Europe. But the medieval warm period is the time when large-scale agriculture spreads. Huge fields of corn and beans and squash, as we see in North America, and usually as large-scale agriculture developed based on irrigation. And these are ideas and techniques that spread into what's now the United States from central Mexico. And then when you have wide-scale agriculture, you can have cities. Cities depend on some way of feeding the people that allows some of the people not to be working on food production all the time.
Right.
And so you see in this era around the year 1000, you see the rise of really quite large cities, cities that are basically the same size as cities you'll see in Western Europe at the same time. And based on corn agriculture, based on irrigation, all over the Mississippi Valley. So that's the sort of southeast and west of the Mississippi River, and then also in the Southwest, which is a sort of surprising place for it. It's an arid place, unlike the Mississippi Valley, and there are huge irrigation projects in the Southwest in this time period that are built to support cities, right, to support large civilizations. And so if you went around much of North America, this is not all of it, much of North America in those first few centuries, first century or so of this millennium, you would see things that don't look all that different from what you would see in Western Europe. Now, there are, of course, important differences, but on that kind of large scale sort of civilization, sort of, they're not that different from each other.
Is are there any differences? The one thing that I'm thinking about specifically is uh the use of animal husbandry. I imagine it's different, like, because
Right.
there's no
Yes. Exactly. Right.
horses or mules
Yeah.
or things on the continent at
Yeah.
that time, right? So I
Yeah.
imagine there are
Yeah.
some significant differences as far as
Absolutely. Right. So there are dogs, there have been horses, and there may be some horses still, but there aren't horses the way the Spanish will bring, the kind of
Hmm.
large horses the Spanish will bring.
Right.
There is some domesticated fowl, but it's nothing like the domestication of animals that has happened by this period in Western Europe, and also in West Africa. So that is very different, and so if anything, there's a larger dependence on agriculture in North America than there is in Western Europe.
Interesting.
One of the really interesting things that made me think in your book is you're talking about, you say that, we're taught that natives will look at them huddling over a fire because they don't have electricity. But at that same time, so are Europeans. Like, it's not just them. It's not like, we were watching TV and they were huddled over fires. It's like
Exactly.
we kind of separate them.
Yes.
And so it seems like we make it look like, or our studies makes it look like the colonizers or Europeans sort of advanced so much faster, but that's really
Yeah.
not the case,
No,
right?
that's exactly right. We do this right inaccurate time comparison. We and imagine that a similar thing happens with disease. You'll hear people say, and this happens in scholarly works too, of and there's definitely some truth to this, but that diseases just hit Native Americans so much harder than Europeans, and
Right.
and that's sort of inaccurately, the comparison is inaccurate because those same diseases hit Europeans horribly at the same time, and just absurdly large swaths of the population had been killed off by various plagues in the early part of this time period. And even after that, in the 16th and 17th century, Europeans don't have antibiotics, right? Europeans don't have vaccines or inoculations for quite a while. And as soon as inoculations start to become widely used among the colonial population in the late 18th century, Native Americans start to adopt them too. The Cherokees are some of the first to inoculate their population for smallpox. So it's extremely important, right, as you say, Lynn, to get your timing right when you're comparing technologies or so-called advancement of different societies.
Right. We love the word context here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, out of curiosity, I mean, we have some questions here that we want to talk to you about sourcing and stuff like that. But in a broader sense, because you're a historian, how much of this work sort of overlapped with what is archaeological work, and how much were you interfacing with that field of study? Because I imagine without written sources, it was probably a lot of stuff, especially in that early period.
Right, exactly. So the early period, I rely a lot on archaeology. There's just been a boom in archaeology in recent generations. There's just so much to work with. Some of my colleagues here at UNC have done just tremendous work on Moundville, which is one of the places I look at. It's a Mississippian site in Alabama, and so I sort of think of myself in some ways as a translator of archaeology. They're doing the actual work, and then I'm sort of putting it in historians' language and into the narrative and talking about historical change. Although most archaeologists do that themselves these days too. They write terrific narrative histories out of the archaeology too. But I knew when in taking on these early centuries without written documents that I would rely on archaeology. And I knew that I wanted to look at oral history and see if oral history of descendant peoples had anything to say about this. But I kind of felt like that oral history would be very would be very general, right, for looking back this many centuries before. And in
Right.
general, the purpose of oral history is not the kind of thing that historians like me want from sources, right?
Mhm.
Their purpose is not to tell me what this happened and then this happened and make it
Right.
all fall in a sort of chronological line. And so I was shocked at how beautifully actually the oral histories that I found fit with the archaeology.
Huh.
And now I'm
Hmm.
looking on a really sort of grand scale. And what I was interested in is what is the fall of the city. So we talked about these cities in the Mississippi Valley, in the American
Hmm.
Southwest, and in the archaeology sees the fall of these cities. And by the time Europeans come to North America, to this part of North America, most of the cities have either fallen or decreased quite a bit in size. Um, and it turned out that when I looked at oral histories from peoples of the Southwest, oral history of peoples of the Southeast and the middle of the continent, there is a lot about about this distant past of great cities, very powerful political religious leaders, and why they fell, or actually, as many of the oral histories put it, why they were brought down by the people on purpose. And
Right.
so the oral histories actually help me interpret the archaeology and fit with the archaeology in ways that I had not even hoped for.
Oh, wow. And did you talk to any, I guess, the descendants or living, people who are in the nations that you researched? Did you have any of that?
Yeah, right. I talked to a lot of mostly scholars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Scholars who, both who work in colleges and universities and who work for
Mm-hmm.
the tribes, and including tribal historic preservation officers, and also just a lot of their own histories that they've written, either in books or on websites or in their cultural centers.
Mm-hmm.
Lots and lots of there just are lots and lots of places you can go to these days to learn how various native nations tell their own history.
Right.
So some of it is talking individually to people, but some of it is just taking advantage of the things that they have made public for all of us to learn from.
Right. It seems like we have less and less excuses to go on the old sort of interpretation
Yeah,
now because,
that's exactly right. That's right. That's right. Yes, it almost becomes willful, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, just as a hook for our audience, and before, just because you have to cover so much time, I want to make sure
Right.
we cover the various periods
Okay. Good.
throughout that millennium. That's in your book. Is there a particular in the pre-contact era, just to sort of like lump all that together? Is there any particular story that struck you, or anything you learned that was sort of like that um, changed the way you thought about that particular period?
Yeah, yeah. I think to me it was just over and over seeing these stories of great leaders being brought down. So,
Hmm.
for example, the Cherokees tell of this elite class of leaders, and so these are religious and political leaders. They combine religious and political power, who basically got too full of themselves, who gained too much power, and as the oral history puts it, they, they just had to be brought down. And so the Cherokee people in the oral history take them out, right? Bring them down, and purposely create a new way of politics that, for the Cherokees, and this isn't the same for all the nations, but for the Cherokees particularly, separates political and religious power. They say we're going to have
Huh.
religious leaders and we're going to have political leaders, but they aren't going
Right.
to be the same people. And this is much more in common with sort of really nations all across the continent. They develop what we today would call checks and balances of different ways of spreading power out.
Hmm.
And there's a war chief, but there's also a peace chief. There is a men's council, but there's also a women's council. There are town leaders, and then they get together in council to
Mm.
make decisions about that affect all of the towns. And if it's a big decision, such as possibly the whole nation going to war, or the whole nation making peace, everybody comes, the women, the men, the children, they all come, and they have to sort of ratify this decision all together. And
Wow.
and so just that, I think that those stories of connecting the pretty specific sounding events in the past with the creation of a whole new way of life. It surprised me and taught me a lot.
And you're able to map those changes to that archaeological record. That's super neat.
Yeah, I
it
mean,
really
not,
is.
pinpointed to a
Sure, yeah.
particular year or even decade, but the evidence of, when a city exists and then doesn't exist anymore, and then you can archaeologists have found people living in smaller towns and farms over a much larger area. It's really, you can really see, I mean, I can't, but the archaeologists can really see that in the ground, right?
Yeah.
And to have that map onto oral history from centuries and centuries ago really makes me think it's really, there's a lot of truth in that.
Huh. Very cool.
That's incredible.
Cool.
So let's move forward. Do you have, for sort of the more recent centuries, do you have something just like you spoke about that sort of either spoke to you or surprised you, or something you didn't realize had such a big impact on North America in general?
Yeah. So one of the most of the chapters focus on a specific nation at a specific time in their history, and I was interested in times when they, to teach readers about times when Native nations had a lot of power over Europeans who were there,
Yes.
and so I knew one of the groups I wanted to use were the Mohawks, because they become so powerful through trade with Europeans in the 1600s. And I knew that was true, and I knew I was going to be one of them. But then looking in the primary documents just brought me all these stories of interactions where they're very human interactions in which they were the people in charge, really. And so the one that got me the most was I came across this letter. It's a petition written by Dutch colonists. So this is New Netherland, the colony of the Dutch that becomes New York, and they're in what will become Albany. And so they're writing to the leaders of the Dutch company that has put them there, and they say, the Mohawks have so much market power. They come into town and they bring their furs and hides that they've produced, and they make so much money off of this trade that we can't, that it's driven the prices up and we can't buy anything. And their example is, and they're so disgusted with this, these Dutch colonists, they're so disgusted. The Mohawks, according to this document and a couple others that refer to it, have developed a real taste for Dutch baking, white bread, cookies, cakes. And these Dutch colonists say, exactly right. Like, you read this document from the 1600s, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Right? Yeah, of course. Cake is good. Exactly. And so the Dutch colonists say, they buy it all up. They buy up all the cakes and the cookies and the white bread. They buy all the white flour. And this is a quotation from the Dutch, and leave us the bran. And so you see these European colonists, I guess, they thought they were the colonizers, right? They thought they were going to be in charge, and they come and they're just eating heavy bran bread. Cookie, the word cookie comes from the Dutch. Like cookies, like the Dutch invented cookies, right? And they aren't getting any cookies. And I just thought that, just on a basic human level, that really shows what's going on there right then.
That's too funny. I'm pretty sure the stroopwafel is a more modern invention, but I can imagine, if
so
you
good.
had if you had the buying power to be like, we'll have all of them, please. Thank
yes.
you.
Yeah.
Right.
Leave none for yourself.
Exactly. And I think it's things like that I one of the things I want to, often this history is told as a completely male history, as if there really aren't any female Native Americans and there aren't any female colonists, and I it's things like baking, right, that get me down on the level where they're Mohawk women they're the ones doing the buying, they're processing the furs and the hides, and they're along on the trip to Albany to negotiate for the what they get for those hides, including baked goods.
I love that.
This is something. So talking about the interconnectedness of trade networks and stuff, because we've covered how there were some Native nations connected to the international markets and furs and hides in other episodes of our show. But I'm thinking, since you covered folks farther west than I think we've ever talked about,
Yeah.
how did that kind of stuff penetrate into the continent? Like, because the
Yeah.
there's the Mohawk having direct contact with the Dutch, but I imagine it
Right.
trickled
Yeah.
down through the rest of the space, because there wasn't a ton of European contact in the middle of the continent.
Right. Not at all. Right. So one of my points in this book is that if you look at the plains and most of the West, which is half the continent, right? And
Yeah.
at maybe more than half the continent, if you look at that, it really doesn't get colonized until after the Civil War. So
Right.
if this is, if I'm, one of the things I'm doing in the book is sort of slowing down the story of colonialism. It's there with all its horrors and brutality, but it doesn't happen overnight, right? And it happens much faster on the coast of New England and Virginia than it happens in the heart of the continent.
Right.
And so what happens is that some of the goods of Europeans spread onto the plains and surrounding areas, and life changes for people, but they're the agents of change, because there are few, if any, Europeans there, and so they adopt more horses. There's actually increasing evidence that horses never completely died out on the plains, but there's a new horse culture that Native Americans develop on the plains in the 1600s. That is actually nomadic. So it's nomadic in a way that their ancestors absolutely were not. So if there's right, the stereotype of nomadic Native Americans, it's something that is pretty rare and is a creation of history. So there were peoples whose ancestors had lived on river valleys, had hunted just some of the time, of the year. They might go for 1 or 2 bison hunts a year. They become horse riders across the plains, not living in river valleys anymore, hunting bison and trading bison products to towns, to peoples who stayed on river valleys, who then become bigger farmers maybe than they had before, because they're producing agricultural products to trade to these peoples like the Comanches and the Kiowas and some of the Apache bands who have become sort of nomadic people of the plains. So life changes dramatically in those centuries, but not because Europeans are there.
I'm just chuckling to myself that there are certain things that when you introduce a couple of factors together, people it seems like humans drift towards a certain way of doing things. It's so funny how, you introduce those horses into the plains, and it's an environment that's very similar to the steppe in Asia.
Exactly.
And then
Yeah.
there's culture, they adopt a very similar approach to how to live. That's like, hey, we have these tools. This is the environment. This is the optimal way to go about this. That's actually very, it's fascinating that it was an introduced thing.
Right. And they don't learn it, right? They develop the same kinds of things, right?
Yeah, it's like convergent
they don't learn
evolution.
it directly, right?
Yeah. That's fascinating.
So another thing you talk about in your book is sort of how historians have changed how they're treating Native history. And I think your book is obviously a really good example of that. But could you talk a little bit about sort of through these eras that you studied, how historians were looking at Native history and then sort of where we are today? Because we know sort of the school, what we learn in school, but there's usually something going on in scholarly circles, the people who are sort of determining the knowledge that then is distributed to, the nation. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's an old version in the 19th and much of the 20th century, which is basically Native people, if they mattered at all, were just sort of in the way, right? Obstacles to the history that was supposed to happen, the colonization by Europeans and the development of the United States. And then that swings in the 20th century to a period when there's more attention to Native American history, but mostly I think importantly recognizes the travesty, the terrible things that happened to Native Americans. But for a while, at least in mainstream history, that's kind of the main message, isn't it? Isn't it sad? The victimization that happened, and I think that was really necessary. That was a necessary phase to go through, and an important reckoning to keep having. But scholarship after that, in the last generation or two, has moved toward, absolutely still recognizing that, but then they're turning perspectives and trying to make Native people, Native nations into the subjects of our stories too, not just the objects. That they made decisions, they affected history, and to look at times when they were not the victims, when they had a lot of power, and then understand the times when they were victims, when terrible things happened to them, in new ways, to just sort of understand, ask questions like, how do they live through this? How do they survive it? Rather than just to focus on the bad things themselves, which obviously are still part of the history. And then I think what maybe the most recent trend, the sort of shift in historiography, has been the development of some new methods of Native American and Indigenous studies, not only to use documents and many other kinds of sources, including oral history, to get at that question of agency, that sort of that perspective of Native peoples, and perspectives, I should always plural, right, of Native peoples in the past, but also to, what I try to do some in this book, which is to connect to the present day, and to both ask of the past, how did Native nations today survive? How did they survive in the form that they did? And also to think about what Native nations need today, what kinds of historical questions they're interested in, and to let those also start to inform the questions we ask and the kinds of research that we do.
Right. When you spoke with Native peoples, did you get the sense that they were embracing their history more? Maybe they're, because they might have been taught that they were victims, and now they're sort of embracing, well, look at all of the, first of all, we survived, and we had agency, and look at all the things that we've done, and sort of, I don't know if they're part of this resurgence, or sort of how all that works.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they are at the forefront of this resurgence. That's exactly right. And some of it, I think, is sort of new ways of seeing their past. Some of it is just making more public some of their stories that had to go underground for a long time because they were, the U.S. government tried to root them out. And also the fact that it has to do with sovereignty and the increasing ability of many, not all, but many tribal governments to sponsor scholarship, right? To send kids to college, to invest in language programs and cultural centers and research in the archives and oral history projects. Like, those are all things that institutions, that governments can support. And when there's a real resurgence of tribal governance, and that has all of these amazing ripple effects, including in history.
Yeah, I think it's really important for work like yours to get out there and disseminate it, because this is drifting into modern politics stuff, but since that's sort of the part of where you bring your book up to, there's important things that are currently happening, like the McGirt decision up in the Supreme Court. It's super and there are people at the highest levels that have very outdated views of this, and people that for a lot of reasons are I would respect, and for a lot of their opinions, and have pretty terrible opinions when it comes to Native peoples, right? I'm thinking of a particular Supreme Court justice that is generally well respected, but she had pretty outdated opinions.
That's right.
That were rooted in very old history.
Right. Right.
But yeah, that's, just to emphasize the importance of these stories being written in a way that is consumable, and even like that's helpful for you to translate the archaeology, the consumable for the educated non-expert to be able to understand.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that one of the most common and most damaging misconceptions that sort of people with good intentions can have is not understanding Native nations as nations, and sort of thinking of them as a race rather than a political category. And that has just god awful effects on court rulings and legislation, that when people don't recognize the sovereignty and the sort of the governance, the importance in governance that tribal governments have. It's sort of circular, but
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because I think that idea, the conception of, and you can speak to how this happened over time. Actually, this would be interesting as far as like when it happened. But like the even the concept of like blood quantums, and
Right.
of those things are. I was surprised when we first started getting into the sort of the colonial era, the early American era of this, about how fluid affiliations with nations were.
Yeah.
Well,
Hmm.
someone was born in one place, you know, decided that they wanted to go live somewhere else, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
they were, a leader in another community that they had no blood relation to at all.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Right.
it
Yeah.
was felt
Yeah.
much more like citizenship than,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Right. When we think of Native Americans as a race, right? If you think of race, it's not some. It's much less. I'm not sure if fluid is even the right word. A nation can decide citizenship, and it can
Right.
say, "Yeah, you can live here." I mean, the United States does this, right? You can live here. You can't live here.
Right.
You can become a citizen. You can't become a citizen, and that's what Native nations can do today,
Mhm.
and that's what they have done in the past. But of course, in between, they have this history, and it's the worst in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of the US government trying to get tribal governments not to exist at all.
Mm.
And so that's the era in which just they're sort of uh, the, the notion of citizenship and who gets to decide who belongs is sort of twisted in those eras when tribal governments can't act on their own in
Hmm.
most cases, or have their powers limited and always questioned by outsiders, and so they're really only, they're coming out of that, but it's hard. These aren't, I mean, citizenship questions are never easy, right? And then they're this this era of white supremacy, and the sort of the attempted destruction of native nations is makes it, all the more fraught, both within and in relations outside of native nations.
Right. One of my favorite quotes that you use in your book really fits in with what we do here at Too Complicated. And you write, when we flip the story of colonialism from European to Native perspectives, we see the long history of North America as it actually was, not as Europeans wished it to be. And I love that because it's all about getting every side of the story.
Yeah.
And that was one of those things that just kind of, it was one where it just struck me and I sort of stopped and I had to think for a
Yeah.
while. It just kind of changed, the way I
Yeah.
was looking at it.
Hmm.
Um, so can you
Yeah.
speak to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. From the beginning of my work and from my dissertation on, I just felt like the documents written by Europeans just kept telling me Europeans weren't as in control. They weren't as powerful as early as you thought, as the
Mhm.
big
Hmm.
narrative tells. And that's I think not I think that is a that was a purposeful rewriting of history. So what
Right.
scholars call settler colonialism. It
Mm.
was the essential to that concept is the rewriting of history. Settlers come, they know that they are the minority of the population. They know the lands that they settle on, even if they think, God has granted to them, or whatever justification they have for being there. They know somebody else lives on that land. They know nations have that land as part of their country. And so
Right.
what they have to convince themselves over time, and what their descendants will definitely rewrite in the late 19th century, especially, is a narrative that, Native Americans weren't really, and this feeds back in what we were saying before, like that they were primitive, they didn't really own the
Mhm.
land, they didn't have, of course, they didn't have cities, they didn't have farming, because if you believe all of those myths, it's easier to believe that they don't they don't really own North America,
Right.
right? They lived lightly on it,
They
and
weren't
they were
using it
going to
right.
pass. They weren't using it
Yeah,
right, exactly,
exactly.
and
And taking
yeah,
full
yeah, and
advantage.
people in this right, white Americans in the 19th century literally say that, right? We use it right, and that's why it's ours now. And then it gets painted back all the way back to Columbus discovers America, the Pilgrims encounter a wilderness, and it's very on purpose, and it is very self-justifying, and It was particularly important self-justification for white Americans in the decades when they were still doing it, right? And so unpacking all of that, bringing back the history as it was actually lived by people at the time, a much less sort of inevitable history, I think is just tremendously
Right.
important for understanding how we got to where we are and how we can undo some of
Right.
those myths and realities.
This is actually a question for both of you, and a little bit beyond the specific subject of your work. But it's sort of jumping off of that idea. Do you find it, because it can be, some people find it painful to sort of re-examine this stuff.
Yeah.
Could you, how does someone who wishes history to be something, and this happens on both sides of those kinds of conflicts, because I have so my personal family history is I'm half Irish and half Indian, right? So they're both colonized by England, right? And there are stories that are, and sort of myths about the pre-colonization Irish that are also just not true, and same with the pre-colonization India of not true, like that people at the same time. And then also, because we talked about the justification of the colonialism itself, but on the flip side, those are fantasy, because they aren't based in truth. So how do you find in your work, even personally, sort of like getting rid of the history as you may have wished it wanted to be? Like, you're reading painful stuff, and you're uncovering things that are probably not, that are uncomfortable in many different directions. So as historians, how do you engage with that sort of personal interaction with the material?
Yeah. It often makes me happy. I study periods that are a little bit longer ago most of the time because
Sure.
I mean some of
Yeah.
the things, if you sort of look at like the sort of I would say, so when I was writing the Mohawk chapter, which takes place in the 1600s, right, there are the Mohawks go to war quite brutally against other native people, against some other native peoples. And if you when the story is being told from their perspective, the perspectives of their enemy, their native enemies, it sounds very different. It is certainly not a triumphal history. And so, yeah, just trying to, I, I think that's the kind of thing that while in some ways there's a heroism in surviving colonialism that I think is fine to celebrate.
Right. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that nothing, nobody did anything bad on that side. And I think, by
Right.
looking at time periods when they had actually quite a bit of power, that means that means they had power over other native peoples. And
Right.
it's quite a while for many native nations before it's Europeans or the United States that becomes the sort of big bad guy. In fact, one of the things that happens over the course of the book is increasing realization, and then the attempts at confederacies and sort of alliances to try to get together with former enemies and combat these colonizers. But I don't know, Lynn, did you have an
Well,
answer to?
I think for me it started with accepting that all of these individuals are humans. I think of stupid stuff I've done. It's like, okay, no one's perfect. And then once you start to accept human flaws, it makes it a little bit easier. Certainly with my dissertation, I mean, it was colonization back, air quotes, to Africa. But just
Right.
reading about slavery in general, sometimes you just have to set the book down and go and sort of because when you read these things, the horrible stories, I mean, I've read stories about how a mother will have a baby and she doesn't want that baby to live in slavery, and so she will actually end that baby's life, to deal with that. And then to be at a historic site and someone says slavery's not that bad, it's at that time you have to control you have to control your
Right.
emotions in both ways, because they
Right.
don't
Right.
know, they don't understand, they
Yeah.
haven't done the research you have.
Yeah.
And going at anyone or anything with emotions, we can't do that as historians.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do, but then we have to step back and say, okay,
Right.
now let's get rid of that, let's get over the emotions and get to the
Mhm.
facts.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah.
it's really just, dealing with trying to understand everybody where they are, the historical actors, the
Yeah.
public, your fellow students, sort of where they are, instead of getting emotionally, how could you say that kind of thing.
Oh,
It's just
yeah.
trying to, put yourself in other
Yeah.
people's perspectives as much as possible.
Right.
And take long walks and pet puppies,
So,
all those things.
Dr. DuVal, in writing such a sweeping sort of story or history, right? How did you find it? Was your approach to get people to empathize? Because if you're saying that connection and sort of
Yeah.
with these historical
Yeah.
actors as people,
Yeah.
one of the jokes that I always make is that anything recorded video or basically photographs, it might as well be Lord of the Rings. Like people, it feels like fantasy. Like it might as well be. It sits in the same part of my brain as like those things. Like it's Game of Thrones and the 17th century are like right next to each other. And then like as soon as we started taking pictures of people, it's in a different
Totally
part.
new.
Yeah, like
today.
that's us. That's here. Everywhere else is in a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago. So how did you find, even given the narrative, your scope of your narrative is so long?
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that worried my previous book, I traced 8 characters over the course of the book, and it took place during the American Revolution, and so I was able to start with them and introduce them, and then show the revolution through them. And so I was really worried that I was like, no, there's nobody who lived 1,000 years. There's nobody I can use here. and so what I try to do is in every chapter have strong characters, and it's easier in the sort of the middle and final thirds of the book than it is in the first third of the book. But pretty quickly, I think partly because sort of Europeans are really interested in identifying Native leaders, so they come to the fore, and I can sort of talk and kind of balance their here's what one, and usually male leader, was doing and saying, and versus here's what the women in this town were doing, and try to personalize it even if I don't have their names. And there's some battles, there are some big events, so I try to sort of use narrative where I can to make things sort of gripping. And then as we move into the late 19th and 20th century, there are just these amazing people like Ruth Muskrat. She's a Cherokee leader who really helps to just even in those sort of darkest years when the U.S. government is really trying to destroy Native nations, as we were talking about, she just she seems like she keeps a smile on her face, and she just keeps doing her work. And they form the Society of American Indians, and just keep telling people who make decisions in Congress and in the bureaucracy that Native Americans are here. They still have things that they want out of the federal government, and those are the people who they keep all of that alive. So people like her, who on a U.S. national level, but also countless people that I will never know the names of, just in within their tribes, within their families, keeping telling their children, this is who we are. We're Kiowa, and no matter what anybody else says, and this is what being Kiowa means. And so I've learned a lot of those stories from Native scholars, like Jenny Tonpa is a Kiowa scholar who wrote a book about that kind of thing, about silver making, and just things like this, just at home, just over and over, being Kiowa, even when everybody else, beyond the Kiowas, were saying that was an outdated way to be, and keeping that alive for the Renaissance that's going on today. So just no sweeping people who last the whole book, but really, I hope poignant and narrative stories of people who made change or made change or preserved things in their own day.
Huh. Oh, that's very cool. So we're coming close to the end of our hour here.
Yes.
And one of the things that we like to say on the show is that you probably, no matter where you're listening to the show from, you probably live within an hour's drive of something cool historically. So we'd love to know, is there any place that any historic sites that you were particularly interested in that are, sort of off the beaten trail that might be interesting for folks to go take a visit to?
Yeah. So what I'm going to say is there is one on your computer that you should go to, and that is that almost every tribe today in the United States has a website. And
Nice.
I encourage everybody, this isn't going to sound like it's answering your question, but it is. Like, I encourage everybody to go to, pick a tribe near you and go to their website. And it may lead you to their powwow or something, and go to that too, right? But start with the website, because I guarantee you it'll have a history section, and it'll tell you something from a paragraph to pages and pages about their history. And it's the history they've agreed on enough to put it on their tribal website. So you can learn a lot from that about their past and how it leads to their present. And then the other thing that I really want people to notice, I have my students do this, go to a tribal website, is the history is just a little part of it. Most of a tribal website is about governance. It's about childcare programs and how to file for citizenship and voting in the next tribal election. And it just brings home immediately that Native nations are governments. They're functioning governments. And so that's where I would have everybody start, on a local tribe's website.
Well, it is very true that no matter where you're listening to this in the United States, there is a local tribe.
Yes.
It does not matter where you are.
You are near one.
Yes, you are
That's
near
right,
one.
right.
Even
How
if
many
you don't
books
realize
did-
it.
Yeah. I think you said more than 500 in your book. Is that what it is?
There are almost 600, yes, more than 500, almost 600 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And then I haven't even counted how many state recognized tribes as well. So, if you're in a state like North Carolina, you're going to have mostly state recognized tribes. If you're in Oklahoma, you're going to have mostly federally recognized tribes. But there's somebody, if not nearby, a few counties over, maybe another state over, you'll find somebody.
And speaking of the Renaissance, I want to make sure we point this out, because we've talked about this before. We like to talk about TV shows, movies, and things like that.
Yes,
Do you recommend any that you think are a good reflection of either, the Renaissance, or more accurate, or a way people could go to their entertainment, but they can still learn something,
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's amazing now is there isn't just one to point to. And I think that's so important, because like the ones I love, they're very different from each other. And that's really important, right? Because this is a big and diverse population. And so Reservation Dogs is terrific. I love Rutherford Falls, because it's about historians. I don't know if you all have seen that. That's actually my favorite. There's Resident Alien, which is mostly about an actual alien who comes to Earth, but also has a lot of Native people in it, and some themes that might echo a little bit with the alien theme.
Well, I love all of those TV shows, so I highly recommend them all. We've talked about Reservation Dogs before, but they're all wonderful. We'll put links to them as well on our show notes. Get people some new fans.
Is there any place that our listeners can follow your work? Do you have a website, or do you post on socials?
You can find me on UNC History Department's website. I also have a website, kathleenduval.web.unc.edu, and I am on Twitter at Kathleen A. Duval, and a few other sorts of sites like that.
Perfect. Well, we'll have all of those links in the show notes. So all you have to do is scroll down, and they'll have a hyperlink, and you can just, go and visit all of Kathleen's work and her tweets, and one easy step.
Buy the book.
Absolutely.
Again, the title is Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. Dr. DuVal, could you have the book with you? You could hold it up for our audience. They'll be able to see it.
Yeah.
So there's the cover. You have no excuse if you see it on the shelf. That's how you recognize it.
Yes. It's a fantastic book.
And also great cover design too. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's nice. It's art by a Kiowa artist, Stephen Mopope. I think they did just amazing job with it.
Yeah. It's
nice.
Very cool.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. This was a lot of fun, and we really appreciate it and appreciate your work. And it's a fantastic book, so hopefully people will go out and buy it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Isaac. This has been a great pleasure.